First of all, I want to thank my colleague from Vermont, the senior senator from Vermont, a dear friend of mine. And as he knows, this is a problem. It's an epidemic all over this country. No state's immune from it. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. It has no home. It attacks and really eradicates all of us. And just an extreme hardship on all the families. And Mr. President, I know you know in Indiana how tough this is also. I've been rising on the floor every week and speaking and reading letters from affected people of West Virginia and other states. I have a letter from your home state of Indiana, Mr. President. I want to read from somebody who was affected by addiction. I have one from my state, too. But, you know, this is something we've been fighting in the CARE Act right now. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation. It's not going to be a cure-all, but it starts in the right direction for us to start looking at addiction, at basically opiate addiction and prescription drug abuse, not as much as we have in the past as a crime, but as an illness. And an illness needs to have treatment. And I think we're moving in that direction. Politically, we're accepting this and going to basically meet that need of treatments, which is so far and few in between. But we have 51 people dying every day. 51 people dying every day. In my little state of West Virginia, my beautiful state of West Virginia, just last year we lost over 600 lives to abuse, prescription drug abuse. I have a state less than 2 million people. From 1999 to 2013, over 700% increase. So this is a product coming on the market greater than anything we've ever seen. We're hoping the FDA gets serious about this. They're hearing us loud and clear. And I'm very hopeful. Dr. Califf was not a person that I had supported, but I'm very hopeful, and I will be supportive of him doing a great job there because he needs to. He needs to step to the plate, change the culture of the FDA. And the reason I say that, Mr. President, is the FDA, I believe, has to take serious their role and not just approving drugs because it meets certain criteria, but also the impact it has on the well-being of these families that have been addicted and the families that have been affected. They need to consider the devastating public health impacts of its repeated decisions to approve all these drugs that don't need to be on the market. So we're very hopeful for that. And the thing that brings that to mind is that it took us forever to get Vicodin and Loratab from a Schedule 3 to Schedule 2. It took us over 3 years. Once we did, it took about 1 billion pills, 1 billion with a B, off the market, 22% decrease in Vicodin and Loratab, which is getting passed out like M&Ms. We know it can save lives, but yet then they came right back with Zohydro against the wishes of their advisory committee. And we believe it's imperative. They have advisory committees for every opiate they want to bring to the market. They must listen to the advisory committee. If they, when I say they, if the FDA, the director and his staff wishes to go ahead and put a product on the market that's recommended not to be on the market from their advisory committee, they should come before us here in Congress. Tell us why they believe this potent drug, such as Zohydro, is needed against the own recommendation of these experts and specialists. We've been flooded with these stories, and I'm going to read first. I'm going to read a story from your state of Indiana first. And this is, the girl's name's Danelle. And she says, I live in southern Indiana, and I work as a server. About 2.5 years ago, a customer by the name of Josh Harvey left me his number. At the time, he told me he was living in Chicago for school. She says, little did I know, Mr. President, he was in rehab there. Granted, I didn't know about his addiction for over a year because we hadn't stayed in constant contact. About a year or so ago, I found out about his heroin addiction. He still told me little about it. I do know it started out with prescription pills and later went into heroin when the pills became harder to get. He served a month in jail in Michigan for the entire month of this past July over heroin-related charge. That was last year. He came home immediately after and overdosed that same weekend he came home from jail. Luckily, his dad saved him that time. Now he got enrolled in college and was going to an outpatient program, and he was doing much better, Mr. President, or so we all thought he was. School let out for break, and I guess all went downhill from there. He came to me on November the 4th of last year, 2015, telling me he had used a couple of times and wanted my advice. She said, I suggested an inpatient program. He went to Wellstone after he left my house. He sat for several hours and finally was given a room, waiting to get in. It's very difficult to find places to be treated. I went and checked on him 2 different times while he waited to make sure that he was still there. Thursday, I didn't receive any calls. Friday, nothing either. Then Saturday morning, The 7th of November, his mother called me to break my heart. He had passed away that Friday, the 6th, over in Louisville, and didn't know who to contact until that Saturday morning, I guess. He had checked himself out of Wellstone, broke into his house, took his Xbox, where he later either pawned it or traded it for heroin. Never in a million years did I think I'd become so close to anybody addicted to heroin. It doesn't discriminate. It can get a hold of anybody and everybody. Never in my life have I been so depressed and heartbroken. All I want is his story shared. He was my happy ending, gone way too soon. That was from our friend Danelle in Indiana, wanted to share that story with us. Let me tell you about the lady we have, Amanda, in West Virginia. Amanda says, I walked into our new apartment. Although we'd only spent 2 nights there, it already felt like home. I was so excited to move in with Nate. We had long been on the fence between best friends and being a couple, and making the decision to move in together had finally settled years of uncertainty. As I turned the corner, I was surprised to see that he was laying in the exact same position as when I left for my morning classes. I knew it had been a rough night of partying, but I thought for sure he'd be up by now and ready to start our busy day of painting and moving. I touched his chest to feel the rise and fall, something that as a mother I'd been doing to sleeping children for years. There's movement. He's breathing. I breathe a quick sigh of relief. I walked to the back of the apartment to set down my things, and that's when I realized that I needed to go and get some things from my old apartment. As I started to leave, Mr. President, she says, my hand was on the doorknob, but something stopped me in my tracks. To this day, I don't know why I turned around. I laid down beside Nate, and I put my arm across his chest. This time, there was no rise and fall. He was not breathing, and when I looked up at his face, his eyes were wide open. But it was obvious that he was not there. The paramedics revived him to the point that he survived in a coma for 1 week. At one point while in the hospital, his eyes opened, and I thought that our nightmare was over, but it was just a muscle reflex and false hope. On January the 30th in 2007, prescription drugs took the life of Nathan Keith Dunn, age 24. Tall, dark, and handsome is what the world saw. Intelligent, funny, witty, loving, and kind were the qualities seen by those who knew Nate best. He was my best friend, my musical soulmate, and sounding board. We were inseparable, and I began to experience an ache in my heart, which 9 years later still occasionally brings me to my knees. But that's just who Nate was to me. He was also the older son of a mother who had left years of abuse at the hands of her husband in order to find a better life for her sons. He was the brother, too, and the only soft spot of a boy who had been hardening growing up on the streets of a town outside of Houston, Texas. It seems as if the only thing that ever kept him grounded was Nate's love. They had one another's back in the best and worst of times. Nate was also the instant crush of any girl who ever laid her eyes upon him. He was the best friend of anyone who knew him. I often wonder who and where he would be today, but I guess I'll just have to wonder forever. I wish that was the end of my story about how prescription drugs have affected my life. But it's not even close to the end, Mr. President. For longer than I can care to admit, drugs have been part of my everyday life. Shortly after Nate's death, I became addicted to prescription opiates. At first, they were prescribed by my doctor. Eventually, I couldn't get through a day without them. I was what is sometimes referred to as a functioning addict, although it's fair to say that such a thing does not exist. To the outside world, I appeared to be fine, normal. Even I held a job. I cared for my young sons. I kept a tidy home. Meanwhile, my tolerance was building, and I began to require more and more of the drugs just to feel normal, just to get through each day. Can you imagine living this life in which you wake up each day wondering if you have enough of the drug you need just to be okay for that one day? So many people are facing this every single day. It could be the person sitting next to you. It could be your child's teacher. Even worse, it could be your own child. The first thing to suffer was my financial situation. Every dime I had was spent on the drugs that would allow me to function today, tomorrow, and if I'm lucky, the next. Then my relationships with friends and family began to fail. It was painfully obvious that I was stealing from them. Next, I couldn't keep a job, a record that still haunts me for the rest of my life. How could I go to work? How could I continue on? Then a catalyst walked in my life. I met a man, a very good man. As he would become closer, I realized that I couldn't bring myself to tell him that I was a drug addict. The thing, Mr. President, this is a silent killer. Nobody speaks. They all keep it very quiet. And if I may have about 1 minute to finish up, I would appreciate it.
Is there objection? Without
Thank you, Mr. President. Very few people know what's actually happening in your life. In order to get help, you have to be willing to openly talk about your issues. And most of us fear being harshly judged, and rightfully so. Trying to treat a person with addiction issues by using medication only or therapy only is like trying to extinguish a raging house fire with a garden hose. She said, I was fortunate enough to have found a medication-based treatment program in my area, which is paid for by my insurance. Amanda's going to move, she's going to move forward, and she wanted this story to be told. And she said that she wanted people to know how difficult it is. What we need to know as policymakers is how hard it is for people in our states that realize they need help and can't find it. So what I ask all of us to do, this CARA bill is a step in the right direction. And it's a piece of legislation that's much needed. And as we move forward today on this piece of legislation, I hope we will find basically the support that people are needing to fight this opiate addiction. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.